Remember the promises given to Abraham? They could be summarized in two ways. The Lord said to Abraham, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will make you a blessing to the whole world." Now there are two kinds of promises. Conditional promises, like you find throughout the law, are promises that depend on obedience. Like, if you listen to and are careful to keep these ordinances, the Lord your God will keep his covenant with you. That's from Deuteronomy 7. However, these promises to Abraham are not dependent on Abraham's obedience. God says, "I will." And when he says something, you can be sure he will follow through. Are you paying attention to how God is keeping his promises? He does it through people like you and me. Now, this is amazing. Even though we are fickle and doubtful, even though our allegiances are always shifting, God is persistent in working out his promises through us. Today, we are looking at a special relationship between Moses and Joshua and the Israelites' belated entrance into the promised land that involves crazy instructions and miraculous results. Now, Joshua was probably about 38 years old when he left Egypt. He was around 40 years old when he was sent to check out the promised land. But then the people rebel against God by refusing to believe God's promise and obey Moses, God's servant. Now, 40 years later, Moses is gone, and Joshua, now around 80 years old, will finally be leading the Israelites into the promised land after crossing the Jordan River on dry ground. But how did Joshua become this great leader? Was he just born this way? Or did Moses do something to train him up? And what does God think about this? There's something about Moses' way of helping Joshua learn to be a great leader that God approves of and participates in. Should we be following Moses' example? Are you investing in other people's lives? Are you building them up to be strong spiritual leaders? Maybe even stronger and more influential than yourself? So now Joshua is the leader of the Israelites, and he's leading the people to grow in trusting God. Again, it's always ultimately God's work, but God is almost always working through people. And this time there's a battle ahead. These slaves and children of slaves must now become soldiers. And sometimes God's instructions are strange. But don't forget that faith is the point. Let me show you something. When I was first learning to play the piano, it seemed like the best players could play super fast. So I tried to play faster and faster, but things just got uglier and uglier. Then my teacher introduced me to the metronome. My instructions were the opposite of what I assumed would help me. I was told to play my scales very slowly. This was boring. But over time, I was able to get my hands to do things that I wasn't previously able to. Is it possible that God tells you to do things that are nearly the opposite of what you think might work? Is it possible that you might be trusting your very limited perspective over God's divine wisdom? True, God's instructions may be strange at times and outright frightening at other times. Remember God's promises. Trust his ways, and you might just find yourself surprised. Those strange instructions might just pay off. If only you will trust God, obey him, and follow. And as always, if we follow God together, it's a lot easier. Let's do this for one another in our classes.